Hi, everybody. Welcome to Building Towards a Just Harbor, Endangered Data, State Violence, and Endangered Lives. And thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with us. I'm Brandon Locke, and I helped organize this panel alongside Joseph Coivisto on behalf of the DLF Government Records Transparency and Accountability Group. First, I just want to let everyone know that we'll be recording today's panel. In the next couple of days, the video will be shared to YouTube, and you'll be able to find links on the Government Records Transparency and Accountability Group wiki, and also on the Endangered Data Week site under this events page. We'll also probably tweet out some of the links. I also ask that everyone mute themselves so that we can reduce the background noise throughout the webinar. Today's webinar will focus on data that documents state violence and the challenges that citizens may face in accessing and using this data to investigate these crimes or to fight for justice. We'll have three speakers today on this topic. First, we'll have Dr. Manan Ahmed, an associate professor of history at Columbia University. And we'll have Gabriel Solis, executive director of the Texas After Violence Project. And then we'll have Dr. Stacy Wood, an assistant professor in the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh. Just so you know, we'll have each panelist talk about their own project. And then after all three have gone, we'll have an open discussion where anyone in attendance can ask questions of the three panelists. You can either put in a question through the text chat, or you can just sort of ask a question when there's a moment of silence towards the end. So without further ado, I want to throw it off to Dr. Manan Ahmed.
Hi, hello everyone. This is Manan Ahmed. I'm thankful for Brandon for giving me this invitation to participate, and for DLF and for Endangered Data Week to host us. I'm here to speak about our project that we ran in last summer, the summer of 2018, which is called Torn Apart, Separados. And this project, as you know or may recall, emerged out of the crisis, or the manufactured crisis, as it were, that was focused on the southern borderlands between United States and Mexico, and which created both a humanitarian urgency for all of us, but also an urgency that we needed to visualize it, understand it, and see how we can intervene in it as scholars or as practitioners in the digital humanities. So let me quickly say just a few words about how the various participants in this group came together. We run a group for experimental methods in humanities research at Columbia University, which is so that's a supra-organizational group with undergraduates, graduates, undergraduate student, graduate student, faculty, and staff and librarians that kind of come together to work on what we call mobilized humanities. In a sense, the ways in which we can bring our various expertise and overlaps to address a particular issue, research issue, or a question of activism. We first did something in response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. We made a mapathon in which we kind of created venue for citizens and concerned folks to donate their time and expertise in creating a map of devastation. And when this crisis on the southern borders emerged in the late spring, early summer, we felt that we needed to come together in a similar fashion as scholars and as practitioners. So the team that we kind of coalesced was made up of Mayra Alvarez and Sylvia Fernandez, who are at the University of Houston, Alex Heal, and myself, and De Sabrera here at Columbia, and Marisa Martinez, Linda Rodriguez, and Rupika Risam. And what we collectively began to think about is how do we assemble at first a data set that can help us think about this issue. And this is where kind of the first challenge emerges, which is a lot of data which is in public interest, of public interest, and off the public, but is collected by government agencies or intergovernmental agencies, is sequestered data or occluded data or data that is under various guises inaccessible. So as we began to kind of think about and research what kind of data exists about, let's say, the Border Patrol or immigration agencies in terms of apprehension, housing, access, deniability, we quickly found that there are, some of the kind of academic and NGO-based organizations that have basically made sporadic efforts to get this data, which is either under the guise of national security or privacy, made inaccessible. We were able to find a big tranche of data that emerged from a FOIA report that the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, which is run by the National Immigrant Justice Center in New Jersey, had received in November of 2017. So it wasn't terribly old data, but it was a massive amount of data set, which was tied to detention facilities, the ICE detention facilities. Once we had this data, we began to kind of reassemble it and then started looking into business records, into various other kinds of federal, state records, and obviously publicly available news records. And so a large part of our effort was simply to kind of start building a data set that can help us think about an ongoing crisis, which was, extremely kind of urgent. This is an urgent task, so we didn't have a lot of time. And that, basically everything we did for Torn Apart Volume 1 happened in about, let's say, a week, maybe 10 days. As soon as we had the data, we began to start to think about how can we bring this data to the public, to scholars, to activists, to allies. And that led us to kind of visualization questions. And how can a visualization convey information and data in an effective manner? And so our first, mapping the detention facilities became a first order kind of effort. And as we began to think about so that was the kind of the first map, which was, a map that showed all of the detention places where ICE could possibly detain anyone. And from there, we began to kind of think about what other optics, let's say, ways of looking this data allows us. And this collaborative process emerged with our team kind of taking up and shepherding data into different visualizations. So we looked at the ways in which sort of, let's say, entrepreneurial businesses that are involved in incarceration and transportation of detained individuals. Where are they situated? We looked at kind of the satellite imagery tied to various organizations that are part of ICE, etc. The quote unquote Muslim banning was happening at the same time. And so one of our visualization looked at the Muslim banned, the people from specific 6 or 7 countries who were not permitted to enter the United States. And then, as you know, we were all our scholars actively engaged, and this was part of some of our research. We were all immigrants, or were looking at and working on questions of migration and immigration. And so we combined this data and these visualizations, and we basically asked a set of scholars to kind of reflect upon this data, to think about this data particularly as data, or think about these visualization as visualization, and write sort of mini essays or mini reflections. And those became kind of a second part of our project, which was to not leave data as untouched, unquestioned, numerical or quantitative certainties, but rather to kind of think about the ways in which the data itself was a product of power and other dimensions, race and gender. And we had a set of essays that we commissioned. We had a set of essays that 2 or 3 of our team members wrote, called Textures. And then we also kind of created a way of a bibliography for scholars and an activist and a list of allies. And all of this kind of superstructure was built around this kind of core data set that we had began with, and that we had augmented, and then allowed people to kind of think about and interact with. And this was our first volume, as we called it, of Torn Apart Separados. And then we did a subsequent volume, which focused on everything from businesses that are flourished as a result of incarceration of people deemed quote unquote illegal, or congressional districts that take large amounts of money from these federal funds, to ways in which the kind of the economy of incarceration, incarcerating those deemed illegal, rested on across political grounds and across kind of demographic urban-rural divides. And all of this second view of thinking about data and visualization was kind of building on basically a basic premise that, the data that the state has collected about us, and the data based upon which it was acting in a specifically draconian manner towards those who are disenfranchised and dispossessed, that data needed to be brought back into the public's view in a manner that allowed them to visualize the violences that it contained, the violences that were inherent in it. So those were kind of our very basic fundamental practices of thinking about data and thinking about, to use your framing, justice, in how, as scholars, as activists, as librarians, we do our jobs, our daily jobs. So, and again, for the second volume as well, we continued the same practice of not just leaving data and visualization as untouched, kind of troubled things, and we invited scholars to think about this data or these visualization to produce, again, reflections, sets of essays that introduce other vectors into the ways in which this data could be consumed by those who are interested and find it important. So the project has, we're hoping, we began it with the idea that this would be an ongoing project, not necessarily just on the question of the borderland spaces, but maybe going into the history of migration and immigration. I teach a class on borderlands, and I'm hoping to incorporate some of the practices and concepts from this project into my pedagogy and into the ways in which we can think of teaching. We're hoping that other scholars and other teams will take some of the kind of manner and mode of an either analysis or presentation that our team came up with, and produce their own versions of Torn Apart. So these are some of the ways in which we have hope for a longer life of the project. We all different members of the group in different fora have been speaking about this project as I am right now. So I want to make sure that I also state that I'm speaking simply on behalf of our collective, and this was in no way, shape, or form my project or anything like that. That this is a collective project, and we were very explicit in crediting the entire team for all of the work that we all did collectively. And so all of us individually now speak about this project with the hope that the ethics, the modes and practices that we have written out could inform other ways in other projects. So I'll just stop there. And again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about this project.
Thank you very much, Manan. So again, I just wanted to remind everyone that we'll have a period for questions after the third talk. So for our next panelist is Gabriel Solis. I will throw it over to Gabriel.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Brandon. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work here in Texas. And just want to say quickly, please forgive me. I have a cold that I'm trying to get over. So I'll try to make it through this. So as Brandon said, I work with a community-based group called Texas After Violence Project. We're in Austin, Texas. We're a small organization. There's just 3 of us on staff and a handful of dedicated interns and volunteers. And we have a partnership with the Human Rights Documentation Initiative, which is housed at UT Austin, the libraries at UT Austin. They're a post-custodial archive, and so they host our digital materials, but we do all of the interviewing and all of the processing and creation of metadata and things like that. And so it's a good partnership for us, and we've had it since 2009. So just some background on the project. We were founded in 2007 by a lawyer here in Texas who was working on death penalty cases right at the last stage. So he was getting involved right before an execution was to take place. And in Texas, the appellate process is usually about 10 to 15 years long between when someone is given a death sentence and when an execution is carried out. And he was noticing how the families of his clients, the people on death row, were basically completely broken and devastated as a result of this long process, and then especially after the execution was carried out. So he founded the project as a way to document these impacts. And in those early years, I was actually involved in those early years as well. And we spent a lot of time just going around the state of Texas and with a camera and an audio recorder and just sitting in people's homes and just asking them to tell us their story. And not only were we working with the families of people who were executed, but it was important to us to try to document how the death penalty impacted the lives of all people that were involved in the process. And so we also interviewed murder victim survivors, defense lawyers, prosecutors, jurors, judges, and even corrections officers who participated in executions. And the point was to try to contextualize the state-generated data around the number of executions, the sort of race and demographics of the victim and the perpetrator of violence, the counties where they took place, and just the very basic information that the state provides on execution. So we saw our role as a sort of necessary context to the state-generated data on this issue. In the last few years since I've come back to the project, we've greatly expanded the issues that we are working on. So in addition to the death penalty, we have ongoing projects around police shootings, in custody deaths, and the impacts of incarceration, particularly the health impacts of incarceration. And what we do is we work with other groups that do focus on obtaining records and data about some of these issues. So I want to focus on one collaboration that we did in 2017 with a group called the Texas Justice Initiative. And they are a data initiative. And one of the things that they try to do is compile all the data that they can related to in-custody deaths. And a lot of this is state-generated records and data, but they're also looking at other sources as well. And then they compile all of that and make it publicly available to researchers and policymakers and the public. And I saw recently that they just put out their end-of-year State of the Data report about 2018, and it's pretty interesting. And I'll go through some of those numbers here in a minute. But in 2017, we formed a collaboration with TJI, basically with a very simple idea, which was, yes, the data was important, but we wanted to dig in a little bit and actually work with the families behind some of these numbers and document the family's story and their perspective on what happened to their loved one. And so in 2017, we focused on 4 issues. We focused on the categorization of custodial deaths as natural causes, of which in that year, 90% of deaths in Texas prisons were categorized as a natural cause. We focused on pregnancy. Thousands of women who are pregnant are booked into Texas county jails and prisons. And in 2016, 165 women gave birth while incarcerated. We also focused on officer-involved shootings. And in 2017, 169 people were shot by police officers in Texas. Half of those were fatalities. And finally, the 4th issue we focused on were suicides in Harris County Jail. Harris County is Houston, Texas, in East Texas. And that jail alone houses 13% of the whole state's jail population and report 3% of the total suicides in Texas jails. So within those 4 issues, we went out and did long form, basically oral history interviews with both survivors of some of these issues and also their families. And so one of the interviews we did was with a formerly incarcerated, now advocate, who talked about his friend who died while they were incarcerated in prison. His friend had a heart attack. And so while that would, by the state, would be categorized as a natural cause, this interview was interesting because he gave some background as to the neglect by the criminal justice system to provide adequate medical care to his friend. His friend was in his 60s, he was in poor health, and they had a lockdown at the prison where they were incarcerated in the middle of the summer. And for those of you who don't know, summers in Texas are quite hot, and also most of the prisons in Texas do not have air conditioning. And so the point of the interview, besides getting the life story of the interviewee and sort of his, how he got wrapped up in the criminal justice system, and his story, was to complicate this idea that this man died of a natural cause. Really, it was because of neglect on the part of the criminal justice system. We also interviewed a woman who gave birth while incarcerated, and she talked about the experience of only having 2 days with her newborn son before she had to return to jail, and how she was basically quarantined when she was back at the jail. They said it was for her safety, but she said, at that time, after giving birth to my child, she really just needed some contact with anybody. And so she sort of talks about how sometimes these policies and practices that are intended to help people actually do the opposite. And then finally, I'll just say one last example from that project. We interviewed the family of a man who, according to the Harris County, committed suicide while he was in jail. The family totally 100% disputes this. And not only was the interview important because it gave some background as to who he was, how he lived his life, and not just sort of the reduction to a criminal history, which is what you tend to get from the county about the case. But also they talked about his fear of going back to that jail because he feared that he would be killed if he was to ever go back to that jail. And so, you know, that's an ongoing investigation, and that's an interesting case because, you know, that's one where there's a direct conflict between what the county says happened and what the family believes is happening. And so, although there are ongoing investigations, I don't think the family ever really expects to get a finding that coincides with what they believe. So, so that's an interesting project that we did in 2017, and it's ongoing. We're continuing to do interviews around some of these issues. So like I said, I would encourage you all, if you're interested in looking at criminal justice data and law enforcement data in Texas, check out the Texas Justice Initiative. It's a really great group, and they're also based here in Austin. So now I just want to talk for a few minutes about why I think it's important to do both, not only the compiling and access to data around state violence, but also to documenting stories and narratives in addition to the other work. You know, what we found in doing this work in the last 10 years around these issues is that survivors of state violence want to share their stories. They want to tell their stories in their own ways, in their own words, without fear of judgment or reprisal. They often feel like they're not being heard by people in positions of power, especially by the justice systems and sometimes the mainstream media. We've also found that they decide to open up and share some of these really personal and very difficult to revisit stories because they think that it'll help other families, and they want to prevent other families from being in the position that they're in. And they also recognize that their narratives are often counter narratives to those put forward by the state or the mainstream media. So in addition to it sort of helping the survivors and the families of victims of state violence, doing this work is also important for activism, advocacy, organizing, and litigation. Beyond just the creation of evidence of rights abuses or records that directly challenge state-generated records, doing this work, we find, also builds campaigns or movements that force the release of some state-generated records, particularly dash cam footage, or other records that are at risk of being destroyed. So a very well-known example of this is the police killing of Laquan McDonald in Chicago. The city only released the dash cam footage of that shooting 13 months after it happened, and that was because of the demands of the community movement that was building in Chicago. And that ultimately ended in a conviction for the officer, which is very rare. There's also susceptibility of state-generated records related to state violence to be manipulated or destroyed. In 2017, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement requested that the National Archives and Records Administration destroy detainee records related to in-custody deaths, sexual assault, and the use of solitary confinement. Another example is the manufacturing of police records by the New Orleans Police Department after Hurricane Katrina to justify the use of deadly force against unarmed citizens. And so even when state-generated records are not physically manipulated or destroyed, we often talk about how the use of certain phrases in state-generated records or in so-called official narratives of state violence actually do the same kind of destruction. So think about phrases like justifiable homicide, response to resistance, failure to obey, excited delirium. All of these are ways that these sort of phrases and concepts linguistically manipulate and destroy records of state violence. A few more points here as to why I think this work is important. We talk in sort of discussing our work and why we do it. One of the things that we've found in a lot of these stories is that they're obviously almost always revolve around some kind of trauma. And so they reveal how the law enforcement and criminal justice systems that we've created today are trauma organized systems. And they demonstrate how individuals, families, and sometimes whole communities are impacted by these trauma organized systems vertically, meaning it spreads across families and communities, and also horizontally, meaning that it spreads across generations. And so one of the projects that we're working on now is also an ongoing project where we interview the children of people who've been executed. And not that they're children now, but we don't interview children, but their parent or an aunt or an uncle was executed. And the idea behind that project, and we're really focusing on the mental health impacts and the physical health impacts, is to try to get a better understanding of the intergenerational impacts, traumatic impacts of the death penalty. So that is an ongoing project. And what we hope to do there is to actually train trauma therapists to be better equipped to work with these families, because there's a lot of overlap between the sort of trauma that they experience and the trauma, say, a family of someone who's killed by police might experience. But there are also some differences. There's when the power that you're up against is the state, and it's not a one-time event. It's something that stretches over 15 years. And so our hope is to actually train trauma therapists to be better equipped to work with these families, and then to connect the families that we work with resources. These counter narratives are often radical critiques of law enforcement and criminal justice systems as forms of structural violence that actually perpetuate violence in the pursuit of justice. So even if the families who are sharing their stories aren't set out to have a radical critique of the systems that we're documenting, they often are, just in telling people their experience, how they failed, how the systems failed them, how they met their needs, etc. And finally, it compels us to engage with ideas of accountability versus disposability. So, this idea that what we're doing now in our criminal justice system is about throwing people away, and disposability as opposed to holding people accountable for the harm that they've done, and then actually seeking some kind of healing for everybody that was impacted by that violence. So I just have a few minutes left, so I want to just talk about this idea of endangered data or endangered knowledge. I've already talked about how some of the state-generated records related to violence, state violence, are endangered of being destroyed or manipulated. But one of the things that I also think about is that the counter-narratives are a form of endangered knowledge that are at risk of being lost, silenced, or erased. And that's another reason why this work is so important to do, I think. In addition to basic challenges such as funding, resources, or technical barriers to doing this work on a widespread level, the stories are also endangered forms of knowledge because sometimes their retelling is just too difficult because of the trauma. Sometimes it's impossible. And a lot of times we work with families where they either say they're interested in sharing their story with us, but they can't, and we understand that. Or they share their story with us, but you almost have more meaning in what's not said, or in the ways that people articulate or understand their experience. And so that's why, and the other thing I should say too is that we do all of our interviews on video. And so it's really interesting to visualize some of these narratives as well, and to try to get meaning from the silences or the movements of people's bodies or their eyes and things like that. It's just very interesting because that's trauma is a pre-language phenomenon. And so a lot of times the way that it manifests isn't through a sort of very articulated way of sharing a narrative. And so they're endangered for this reason too, but also because we sometimes lose the storytellers because of their experiences of trauma as a result of state-sanctioned violence. And so, I've seen in my own work, working on death penalty cases, working directly with families on appeals, I've seen people's health totally deteriorate over the years that we're working with them on their loved ones' appeal, both physical and mental health. And so, two well-known examples from outside of Texas that I often think about when we think about how these stories and experiences are endangered forms of knowledge because we lose the storyteller. As I think about Erica Garner, the daughter of Eric Garner, she became a very effective and outspoken activist, Black Lives Matter activist, after her dad was killed by police in New York. Erica was 27 when she died from heart-related complications. And I saw an interview that she gave a couple of weeks before she died, and she was talking to the interviewer about the stress that she was feeling just as a result of what happened to her father. I also think about Vanita Browder, who's the mother of Khalif Browder. Khalif, as we may know, was incarcerated in Rikers for 800 days, ultimately not charged with anything, and dealt with a lot of depression. When he was released, he was, sadly, Khalif was beaten by guards, but also by other inmates. And Khalif killed himself after he was released, and his mother died not long after he did. And so there are so many examples of this, but I feel like we don't, a lot of times the families get lost in the discussion when we're talking about the health or the traumatic impacts of state violence. And so again, I think that's, I'll wrap up here, but I'll just say, I think these are all just a few of the reasons why I think the work is important, not just finding and making accessible the data, but also the stories that are always within behind the numbers. And it's important that we do this work ethically, responsibly, and inclusively, so we don't perpetuate the same violence and traumas that the law enforcement and criminal justice systems are. And so we take this pretty seriously in our work. I don't have time today to go into how we do the work, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about that in the Q&A, or even afterwards. Be happy to talk to anybody who might be interested in how we do our work. So I'll stop there, Brandon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriel. Up next is Dr. Stacy Wood. I'll throw it over to her.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Can you see my slides? Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be on this panel with this group of people. Really beautiful work that you guys have been sharing. You know, I'm at the University of Pittsburgh now, and I teach in the archives program, and I also teach in the computer science department in a sort of ethics, values, history role. I've kind of become their go-to person for a whole sort of raft of classes and concepts. And so I'm thinking a lot about the sort of intersections of these worlds, and thinking about how those conversations end up being kind of siloed. And I have to say, I apologize for this. I changed what I was going to talk about once I read my colleagues' abstracts. And so I'm not going to focus as much kind of on the historical piece that I intended to. And instead, I want to sort of talk about a few challenges and sort of pain points, areas where we can focus together or think of solutions together. And my hope was to sort of think about ways we can keep this conversation going by trying to link up some of the sort of common threads through all of our talks. So, you know, part of what I'm interested in is thinking about the kind of paradoxical claims that within law enforcement concerning their own relationship to the labor of information work. We're sort of in the middle of a few decades of kind of newly coined terms meant to communicate methodological and technological novelty. So terms like, you know, we've all heard evidence-based policing, which presumably center kind of information gathering and technology at the heart of police work. And yet much of the new sort of technological procurements and relationships kind of rely on a marginalization of that same work. So I won't go into it too much, but I do want to sort of give a little bit of a sort of contextual backdrop to some of my work, which focuses kind of on the R&D side and the marketing rhetoric of companies that serve the police as their primary client. So, you know, new data gathering techniques and technologies have recently found application through the implementation of cloud-based evidence management systems connected to a range of emergent tools, such as police-worn body cameras. Not limited to them, but that precipitated a lot of the larger sort of funding packages that have made this more of an everyday practice. So, you know, there's sort of a convergence of policy and technological development and resource scarcity. And so the police-worn body camera programs has kind of presented substantive infrastructural challenges for law enforcement as they kind of contend with data storage requirements, interconnected systems. So companies like Axon, which is formerly Taser, and they're sort of the leader in this market, have kind of transformed the labor of policing and the production of gathering of information, specifically through a cloud-based integrated platform. So there's a sort of police workflow via constant and consistent interaction with digital interface. So there's still this sort of paradox about a lack of information, right? As we're hearing, the spaces where you actually get official information, and I'll talk a little bit about the relationship and the need for new sort of evidential context to follow what Gabriel was saying. But we still have areas about which we don't know anything about what the police are actually doing, right? Officially, we know what they're doing experientially. So, okay, so the first thing, let's see, that'll work. Okay. Apologies. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is access and maintenance of information. Policies governing access to information are idiosyncratic and exist in kind of various stages of development. So some jurisdictions have robust state record-keeping laws governing access and public disclosure, and the rules are clear, published, and accessible, and then some are ruled by agency policy. At times they are ambiguous and leave a wide berth for interpretation. Again, this is some of the sort of techniques you can see that Gabriel mentioned, right, about using sort of flattened language or using kind of very hyper-local practices to kind of sweep over any sort of official record. So although proprietary systems within law enforcement are not new, there are kind of emergent risks and challenges that I think we need to be thinking about regarding the trends of the past few years. So, many law enforcement agencies actually have multiple proprietary information systems, all the way from CAD data, which is, whenever 911 is used, it produces that data, all the way to prison and intake information. So one of the really interesting things that I found about going to events or gathering which cops are sort of talking through information problems is that they spend a really significant amount of time complaining and troubleshooting interoperability, authority control, problems. They just don't have the same vocabulary we do, but it's a lot of the problems with which a lot of us are very familiar. And there's no incentive for companies to work together towards interoperability and no governing body seriously contending with standards creation or oversight. So it leaves a kind of vacuum for companies, particularly Axon, to come in and offer these kind of end-to-end full service options. And it also contributes to a kind of siloing that begs questions about long-term infrastructural buy-in on the part of private companies. So, if that arena no longer produces consistent and large enough profits, what incentive remains to invest in continued maintenance? So I'll move on to legal categories. So there's sort of a, not all of these are completely kind of one-sided. There's a really sort of interesting effect about putting everything in a sort of networked information environment. So one aspect of this kind of forced formalization of police and public interactions, if the cloud-based records management system manages information from sort of the first moment that a member of the public interacts with law enforcement all the way to the prosecutor's office, then every sort of step of that should, in theory, be formalized. Of course, as I found in my research, as soon as you start talking about formalization, workarounds, hacks, ways of getting around these processes come up. I sort of had this notorious early interaction with an informant who was telling me about how no one in their agency wanted to deal with multi-factor authentication, which was sort of the big, one of the big security features that Axon was promising, and a way that they were promising you could trust their audit trails was that they were tied to each person using the system. And immediately when I started to ask about this, you got a lot of officers talking to me about workarounds. And one told me that they would just sign in under one person's name and then keep that signed in all day because no one wanted to deal with the hassle of multi-factor authentication. So you have this kind of assumption, right, that things are now running smoothly, going along these formalized lines. There are also ways in which these processes are pushing against kind of former legal categories, things like police notebooks, which in many jurisdictions are not subject to subpoena, right, are things that are considered informal and personal communication between individuals. In previous, prior to this, we would have just had an official report, which is something that, again, kind of adopts a standardized, sanitized language, often kind of fashioning justification for use of force or in custody violence after the fact. We wouldn't have access to those notebooks. So there's a way in which there may be a way of kind of cracking through those separations in these cloud-based systems. One of the sort of interesting things that I found too is the sort of changes in actual labor practices, but also this sort of change in rhetoric. So, when I started looking at the issue of body cameras years ago, one of the things that kind of pops out at you is the difference in rhetoric. The way that people were talking about body cameras, particularly within the federal government, if anybody's read through that kind of the Obama era funding announcement, you hear a lot of language around transparency and accountability and building trust, community policing, right? Rapturous kind of promises. And if you look at the marketing materials of companies like Axon, you see an entirely different story. You're hearing more about how this body cam technology is actually there to protect the officer, make sure that they're believed, right? So you have these sort of dueling narratives. And you have a sort of similar thing happening with respect to information labor within law enforcement too, where there's a lot of language now, and I just clipped this one piece, but it's basically everywhere in every sort of records management or automation marketing material that's about what real police work is. So putting officers back on the street, getting back to your real work, sort of denigrating information work as a part of this process. And, there's a lot of sort of heavy irony there, not only just because records end up being one of the things that follows people, right, becomes sort of intractably linked to their identity and actually does control their body and their bodily integrity many times throughout their lives. So it's oftentimes, one of the sort of more important things to think about is the integrity of that record. But it's often sort of played down. And what I've started to notice, and I don't have any sort of formal numbers on this, but it's something that I'm going to be looking into, is there's also a gender dynamic about information work when it comes to law enforcement. If you go to any of the sort of tech conferences, you'll see that any panel that is about public information, records professionals, those rooms are all full of women. So there's sort of an interesting dynamic there as well. Okay. So another thing to think about in terms of sort of from the tech sector, their research and development priorities is there's this heavy large city dominance. So there are an estimated 18,000 law enforcement agencies throughout the United States, and that does include campus police. As of 6 years ago, the Department of Justice estimates that almost half of the country's law enforcement agencies have fewer than 10 sworn officers. But when we think about procurement and contracts, they favor large cities for a whole host of reasons. And one of those is that these business models are now almost entirely reliant on the production and consumption of data. So, a body cam program, the actual body camera is a couple of $100s, but the subscription to the actual evidence management service and the sort of access to the data is the thing that costs the money. So not only are large agencies able to provide these companies with massive amounts of training data that makes the infrastructural investment worth it, but they also have support staff, people to actually deal with, to work through contracts, right? And they have the budgets to pay them. So I did recently, I was at a conference where I saw the new machine learning team that was acquired by Axon talking about their new projects. And one of the sort of interesting, sort of eye-opening parts of that was them talking about how this two-person machine learning team won a project through LAPD, and then immediately Axon acquired them, right? So there's also this interesting kind of procurement and contract game that's going on where things are getting sort of picked up and dropped off and renegotiated according to the size of the agency and the company. So part of this is, you know, all about large city dominance, but it also is about these systems being optimized based on the needs and practices and cultures of larger departments, kind of eschewing local context. And when I'll talk a little bit about kind of grassroots information gathering, and we've heard about that already. So in thinking about the relationship between kind of local context and the possibilities for accountability and the possibilities for counter narratives versus the kind of optimized, flattened system, those are really sort of important points of convergence. So I think there's also just this kind of, you know, basic techno-deterministic, techno-utopian logic and rhetoric about tools, right? That we don't have to have structural solutions. We can't talk about, you know, dismantling the entire system. What we're going to do instead is put a camera on every car, and that's going to solve all of our use of force. It's going to solve all of our bias issues. It's going to solve the sort of structurally racist aspects of, well, all of law enforcement, right? So, there's this kind of investment in that as the easy solution that I think is going to be something we're going to keep confronting. And again, we can see this when we look at kind of the body cam language, but also when we look at the ways in which machine learning and AI are being talked about, as well as when we talk about recidivism and risk assessment algorithms. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the assumptions kind of accompanying this language around these technologies posits that, you know, machine captured or produced information is automatically more objective and therefore better than human generated information. Again, kind of eschewing processes that are familiar to anyone engaged in complex information work, right? Which is messy and contextual and constantly changing. So part of this too is thinking about the impact of intellectual property arguments. So, you know, I talked a tiny bit about algorithmic risk assessment, but one of the biggest issues I think we'll be kind of confronting continually throughout the criminal legal system is the ability to confront these systems in meaningful ways, because that would mean having access to the ways in which they actually work. So if we look at decisions like Loomis v. Wisconsin, which went to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, this is a decision that held that it was not necessary for the plaintiff to be able to understand how he was assigned a risk score from an automated system in order for him to defend himself. So he was confronted with a risk score, didn't know how he got it, that dictated whether or not he was going to be granted parole, whether he was considered a risk regarding recidivism. So he's confronted by a black box, and what you can actually confront or regulate or understand is limited by this kind of intellectual property claim. And when we look at some of the projects that are going on with Axon, and then another area that I've been looking at as well is in three-dimensional crime scene reconstruction and looking at laser scanners that actually kind of capture millions of data points and then are used to create courtroom narratives later on, we can see that there's just so many stages and so many mechanisms that are hidden in those processes that get kind of shoved under the rug of mechanical objectivity, again, going back to that techno-utopian rhetoric, that hide all of the workings of that. So in the cases of the case of the 3D scanners, you see, well, yes, it's a camera that captures millions of data points, but then someone has to sit in a room, run it through software, deal with all of the ways in which there are awkward visuals and smoothing things out. And there are also all of these ways in which branches of forensic science are encoded into that software. So there are just layers and layers and layers and layers of kind of expertise and processes that get flattened out through black box technology. So another thing that I sort of wanted to bring up, and to return to a lot of sort of Gabriel's lovely work here in thinking about what the relationship is between different kinds of information and how we can kind of push against evidentiary status, at least shift it a little bit, or talk about how these things can be in conversation. So we're in a historical moment of ubiquitous capture. So there are various forms of documentation have been used to kind of catalyze activist communities, tell counter narratives, create kind of affective spaces for people to really foster community through shared experience. And, it's still the case, though, that activists are left vulnerable and their documentation is rarely given the same status in a juridical context as footage that's captured by law enforcement. And we can think, to return to the Eric Garner example, Ramsey Orta, had a terrible time, was harassed by police and was arrested on a different charge. So there are all of these ways in which the folks that are documenting these things are also sort of under the microscope and under threat as well. In use of force cases, right, there's this sort of an understanding of the point of view and emotional state of the individual officer as being paramount to basically any other variable. So point of view footage has this kind of legal bolster. And one of the sort of kind of horrific things that I've been thinking a lot about in this 3D scanner work, and how I actually came to it, was that it was used in the grand jury, or it was shown to the grand jury by a prosecutor in the case of Tamir Rice, even though we had footage, right? So we had footage from across the street and above of that shooting, and yet there was still seen to be a need to create a 3D rendering that was from the point of view of the officers, instead of the sort of, for lack of a better way of putting it right now, but a sort of objective third eye right from across the street. And as you can see, I put these two photos together. You can see the difference in sort of everything about the sort of tone of the photo and the environmental landscape, and even just the time of day and the color. So it was seen as sort of necessary in order to basically defend the actions of law enforcement, to make a counter-narrative video that was from their point of view, even though there was pre-existing video. So there's also this, I kind of think of it as this is a lazy way to think of it, but it's useful as a kind of Colin Powell logic, right? Which is about claiming that the photograph that you're seeing shows you everything that you need to know, right? Here's a picture, here's a satellite photograph of WMDs, and then also telling you when you question the photo that you don't have the expertise to see what it actually represents. So there's becoming this kind of interesting flip where, we've spent years advocating for cameras, now we have cameras, and if the cameras don't tell what the cops want them to tell, then now we have this new technology that creates a 3D rendering from our point of view. So I think we need to sort of think about, whether or not it's even possible inside of the sort of criminal legal system that we have for counter narratives, or for alternative testimony, or for citizen documentation to even sort of push against those barriers, or whether or not it just needs to exist in a different space entirely. So I know this isn't, I painted a super hopeful picture, but I did want to highlight some ideas and some work by some wonderful colleagues. So, grassroots programs like CopWatch are kind of in the midst of trying to assemble a working and easily usable database of their footage. organized folksonomically in order to provide information to activists on the ground that is useful. And so, CopWatch has always relied on a kind of small data approach based on the assumption that you can identify persistent behavior and hold individual law enforcement officers accountable through community pressure, rather than focusing on a larger systemic approach, or at least, with that particular work. So I think that there's a kind of symbiosis here of structural and grassroots approaches that's crucial to thinking about how we can make interventions. So I think, grassroots organizations and civilian oversight boards, and really sort of talking to civilian oversight organizations about standards creation and procurement and contracts. I find that when you do this, there's not a lot of concentration or focus on things like record keeping and data management. There is a lot of understanding around access, obviously, but it tends to sort of stop and start at the public record request standard. And there are ways in which we can actually kind of push against that or go beyond it. Okay, so I'm going to end there. But I just wanted to sort of throw out some of the things that I've been noticing and thinking about in my work. And I'm really, really happy to talk to anybody again in this Q&A or afterward in any form you would like. And thanks so much for having me.
Great, thank you, Stacy. So now I want to open the floor up for questions. Feel free to just unmute and start talking, or you can type out a question in the chat.
Thanks, Scout.
I'll just read that. So Scout says, will you have papers or publications I can read or cite later?
I'm happy to start off the answers. I do have a piece that's on the history of police data, and one of the points that I meant to make but forgot in my sort of disorganized rant today was about sort of reframing police data as crime data, because that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the official channels of information. So that that's out in Kula. That actually many of the folks involved in this were helpful in putting together. And then I'm working on a few pieces right now, so there will be things eventually.
Yeah, for me too, I have a article in Kula that just expands on some of the points that I made today. But beyond that, my organization also puts out these very small publications that has portraits of some of our interviewees that we work with, and then segments from their interviews. I find that educators like to bring these into their classrooms and just sort of integrate them into their syllabi. So we have a couple of those made, and we're making new ones on different issues around police violence and the death penalty. And then finally, I'll just say we do also have some short video on our website that brings in segments from some of our interviews.
And our site, Brandon had helpfully put the link to Torn Apart, and our data and the analysis and everything that I was speaking about is all out there, and you can for sure peruse it. And we're hoping, as I mentioned, to grow this project and publish not just the information that's there, but all more analytical pieces. Thank you.
There's a question in chat for Gabriel, and it says, since the death penalty is state-based and your organization is state-focused, is there a sort of overarching coordinating effort regarding death penalty issues, especially regarding lethal injection with replacement drugs?
Yeah, it's interesting. Most of the work that we've done with groups outside of Texas actually haven't been related to the death penalty. And we haven't really gotten too involved in the issue of the drug cocktails that are used for lethal injection, although we're very aware that is one important avenue that lawyers and advocates are pursuing to halt executions. We did do a project a couple of years ago on the legal advocacy strategies behind the death penalty. And then there's also another project out of Colombia called the Rule of Law Project that I briefly worked on that also looked at some of the strategies related to abolition of the death penalty in the United States. But yeah, in response to your question, no, but I would be open to that, especially with other groups that are taking on the death penalty from sort of how we are, which is let's also, in addition to all the other arguments around lethal injection and cost and arbitrariness and race and all the ways that sort of people have been attacking the death penalty, our approach is let's look at the health impacts on everybody that's impacted by it, and including mental health as well.
I have a question. I'm struggling to sort of formulate it well, but Gabriel and Stacy specifically talked about the idea of counter narratives a couple of times through the use of body cameras or 3D reconstructions and through interviews with family. And it could be fair to say that what the Torn Apart Project is also a counter narrative. But I'm wondering if you all could talk a little bit about the challenges of creating counter narratives, particularly when you're relying on state resources, whether it's documents or data or video or anything like that, and how you can kind of work through and around that when you're relying on the state to sort of give you ammunition to fight back or ways to counter that.
Do you want to go ahead, Stacy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on this as well, but I think it is such an almost sort of alternate reality position to be in, to sort of be kind of always critiquing, right, the narrative that the state is producing, and yet always have to kind of marshal these informational resources to make your argument. And there's this kind of deal with the devil aspect to it, where you have to say, well, okay, here are the numbers, and I know the numbers because here's where I got them. And then also trying to critique what we know is what we know about how those numbers are produced. So there's this very sort of uncomfortable relationship there that I'm not sure I have an answer to, other than to say that it's kind of important to constantly do both, right? In order to sort of think about, I'm all for, in the meantime, until we take this whole system apart, as much documentation as possible. But it's also important, again, to constantly think about exactly what Gabriel was pointing out. When you use of force or in custody death, or when, there's this beautiful art piece that, of course, I'm forgetting the name of, that is all about kind of going through and reading between the lines of official narrative. And so I think, both of those things are kind of in tension, but hopefully productive tension when it comes to these kinds of projects. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and in our work, we, when we're preparing to do interviews with families, we definitely engage with state-generated data and records, but always recognizing that it's really just background for us, and really our purpose is to document the family's understanding of what happened, even if that is in conflict with um, uh, the official version. Often it is. So on the one hand, there's a question about whether the records are accurate. And so like with the group that I mentioned before that we work with called Texas Justice Initiative, which is a data initiative, they up front say these are state generated records, they're trying to compile them for the public. But they're also pointing to the problems of categorizing in custody deaths, for example, as natural causes or as other. So our job then is to go in and identify those cases where, a healthy person goes into jail for a drug charge for a month or two and then doesn't come out, and then it's categorized as a natural death or natural causes. And so there's, both recognizing that the records may not be reliable in some way, that they may not be complete in another way, and then going in and trying to contextualize them with all of that in mind. The other thing I'll say, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's important, is that some people in critical archive studies have done some really interesting work on this idea of archival imaginaries. And that, I like that concept as it applies to the families that we work with too, because sometimes the family's belief about what happened to their loved one may not be what actually happened. And it might actually be disputed by state-generated records. But again, our job, I see our work as not then confronting the families and saying you're wrong, but actually trying to find meaning in why it is that they still hold on to the belief that X happened when actually Y happened. And I still find that there's a lot of meaning in those counter narratives as well, even if for some reason they're either disputed by what actually happened. I still find that they're important not only for the families, but also still as a critique of whatever issue it is that they believe was responsible for the death of their loved one. So, for example, the family that I mentioned before with the brother who the county contends committed suicide, they don't believe that. If there's there is a video recording that I've seen of them bringing him out of his cell, but there's no video recording of him in his cell. Even if there were a video recording of him in his cell that confirmed the county's version, still their activism, they're going out into the front of the district attorney's office, once a month with, bullhorns and posters demanding justice for their loved one, is still in itself a valid critique of the treatment of inmates in Harris County Jail. And so, again, I feel like that's a little off, one-off response, but I still find that it's, beyond fact. It's these counter narratives can still be very useful and important.
I'll just quickly add that I think most of us who worked on Torn Apart were scholars from the kind of post-colonial strain or decolonial, and much of what we do was foregrounded in thinking through data as a construct and a construction, and how do we then tell any narrative at all, which is not the narrative that coercive power wants us to understand. And so in that sense, I think for our particular project, that was the kind of need for us to kind of surround the data set with reflections and interrogations of the data, so that there is no valorization of data qua data. There was always the foregrounding of the fact that these are constructed data sets that have obfuscations, illusions, and silences built into them. And I think so counter-narratives become the only possible ways in which we can interact with any kind of numerical data. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat. What advice do you have for graduate students with limited resources who are trying to build similar grassroots DH collective projects?
I'll just say something quickly here. Today, it's not hard to get good equipment for relatively low cost. For me, it's more of it's less about the cost of the equipment I'm talking about for our work, which is sort of documentation work, than it is about being prepared and being aware of not causing any harm in the process of doing the documentation work. And we do a lot of trainings for grassroots activists and advocates and students who, for example, I just did a training a couple of weeks ago for a group of undergraduate students who were going down for their alternative spring break to document stories along the U.S.-Mexico border, and they're just using their iPhones, and so we talked about the risks of recording people who may not be documented or who are activists on the ground in those communities, and then like turning around and putting up those videos on YouTube. How not to do that, but to think carefully through how the videos and the audio recordings of the interviews would be used, et cetera. So for me, it's less of I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that really, other than to say resources is one issue, but also preparation and making sure that we're not doing any harm in the process of our work is also important.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I think one of the things too that I have found is that people who are working on DH projects, people who are working on documentation projects, archives, libraries people, we're helpful people. We're people who like to share resources. So I think, in terms of also thinking about mitigating and minimizing harm and trauma and sort of mistakes that can happen with unintended or intended consequences. I think, making a sort of list of all of the projects that you think are really doing it right and creating a network with those people, like just find your sort of, comrades in what you want to be doing and build on that expertise. Because I think so often we see projects that kind of consistently try and reinvent the wheel and start over from scratch. And sometimes that's good because we need to scrap some of our bad habits and bad practices. But sometimes there's really amazing work already going on that you can plug into and actually, signal boost what they're doing, or maybe there's something going on already that you don't know about. So I think getting the word out on what you're trying to achieve and creating a network is also a really important part of that process. I will not answer the question about funding because I have trouble getting funding for my work these days. But if the other folks have strategies for Ina, I see a new question.
I can just add that the Torn Apart project was done as volunteer labor. Our group for experimental methods has no direct funding of any sort. We are, some of us, in tenure track positions, some are staff positions, and as I mentioned, some are graduate students and undergraduates. But so all of this work is extra to our other responsibilities. But there is the question of solidarity work and alliances and doing organizational work that brings you together under an agenda. And I think that whether we're undergrads, grads, latter faculty, precarious, part of the precarious faculty, the call of the day really is building alliances and building networks. And within that network, those networks, then, as Stacy mentioned, working on existing projects, signal boosting, creating something together are all possibilities. And I think that one of the key things in which the digital activism or digital work can lead as example is because much of it has always been collaborative work, even if it's not been recognized as such. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Manan and Stacy on that. I mean, a lot of the ways that we're able to do so much of the work that we've done as a small nonprofit with a small staff and a small budget is through collaborations and partnerships with other people and activists and organizations. On the issue of funding, though, from a nonprofit perspective, it's very difficult. And I think many other community-based nonprofits who are doing this kind of work will tell you that it's difficult to find funding, and it's an ongoing struggle. Like we are year to year, which makes it hard to full circle back to the issue of partnerships and collaboration. Sometimes makes it hard to build those because we don't know how long we'll be around. So for our project, though, I should also say that even though we have a partnership with UT Austin, we don't receive any financial support at all from the university. None. What we do receive is really great students who come to work with us on various projects. So for our funding, it's, again, I think you'll find this with a lot of nonprofits, which is that we have to come up with different avenues for funding. So on the one hand, we've been able to be around for so long because we have a few private donors who recognize the importance of this work and are able to help us sort of keep the office space and some staffing. But beyond that, we write grants for all of our programmatic work. We do fundraisers. We're doing a fundraising campaign right now here in Austin it's called Amplify Austin, which is a 24-hour day of giving. We're all over that. But we're also now experimenting with developing and offering continuing legal education trainings for lawyers to sort of build in some trainings around learning some issues relevant to our work, and then the attorneys actually pay for those trainings. And so we're experimenting with if that can be a possible way of supporting some of our documentation archival work that's hard to get funding otherwise.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone?
Well, let me then thank, if there are no questions, let me just thank Brandon for bringing us together and introducing me to the work of Gabriel and Stacy. Thank you so very much.
Sure. I want to add Joseph Coivisto helped out a lot, Rachel Matson also, to think about this panel and think about who we wanted in here.
I want to echo that thanks. I really appreciate it. It's been lovely. And I'm very excited to learn more about everybody's work going forward.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to all three of you, Manan, Gabriel, and Stacy. Thanks for again spending your afternoon with us. With that, we'll head off. Thanks again. We'll be posting this to the Endangered Data Week website within the next several days.